you will see that I believe in the uniqueness of distinctive historical contexts, but that I dismiss neither the possibility that historical processes may connect them, nor the possibility that the thought of one era may be translated into the language of another and made to address the latter's concerns. What we call early modern political thought, the 16th through 18th centuries, broadly speaking, has helped to shape a history not only European, but entailing a particular definition of Europe and its history, geographically and culturally distinctive. The extensive literature of the subject massively informs us that we have to do with a Europe not only Greco-Roman in its cultural foundations, but geographically limited to those areas where the Latin language predominated among the learned over the Greek, and the Roman Catholic Church, with its Protestant and enlightened adversaries, over the Greek Orthodox. These limits were often exceeded, but never abolished. During the medieval and early modern periods, I hope you can hear the inverted commas in my voice, the Latin Christian civilization expanded, first into the two European and Scandinavian peninsulas, and then oceanically into the two American continents. In the latter expansion, it began to encounter the question of rule over peoples not previously known in either its sacred or its profane histories. In the former, it entered on several other Europes, defined in Orthodox Christian and in Ottoman Muslim terms, and the dispersed Jewish peoples found themselves marginal to the dominant concerns of all three, while never, of course, to their own concerns. It is at this point that we encounter the third term I have used in my title, the term revelations, employed in all three cultures and affecting their politics and political thought. It's a historical fact, however, that the history of political thought we speak of has been presented in terms overwhelmingly not only European but Neo-Latin, so that the meanings given to the word political itself have been shaped by the encounters between Christian churches and Neo-Latin European forms of government, republican, imperial and monarchical, ancient, medieval and modern, early modern, modern and postmodern. And this is a history, obviously a complicated and multiplex one, that we have to face in pursuing the goals of this conference. Let me begin with republics, as there is a historical order in which they appear earlier. They serve to remind us that the history we relate is Mediterranean before it is European, the latter word being used to introduce the interior spaces of the West Eurasian Peninsula. And this history emerges from heroic epic with the formation of city-states surrounding the Mediterranean Sea like frogs round a pond, as Plato makes Socrates put it somewhere, constituting an ecumene held together as much by sea routes as by land. And it's worth asking whether any other civilization has a history like that. These cities, or so their literatures tell us, are citadels of warriors engaged in agriculture and in commerce. And out of the heroic, there emerges the political, the rule by interacting groups of citizens who call their self-government liberty. The word republic, which we use to denote this form of polity, is of course late in appearing. It's Latin rather than Greek, and only by stages does it culminate in the culminating in the European Renaissance and wars of religion, does it come to be used as the opposite of several distinct kinds of monarchical rule, kings, emperors, and princes. It is nevertheless lodged in both Greek and Roman consciousness by political experience and by several forms of literature authoritative in both Mediterranean and European literacy and scholarship. And I wish to repeat at this point the question whether this is or is not peculiar to West Eurasian history. These cities are of course shaped by interactions with other civilizational structures, Egyptian and Persian. But there comes a time when these are only interactions. Libertas and imperium, to use the Latin terms, constitute a subjective world to which a political consciousness addresses itself, and in it develops concepts of the political, which it denies to other civilizations and their forms of government or rule. But the history of heroic political systems is, of course, tragic. Freedom produces power, and what we call empire, the extension of imperium over the collective self to imperium over others. The two meanings of the word come into collision, and disasters ensue. In the intellectual history of Athens, these disasters produce one great work of historiography, that of Thucydides, and what has, for reasons far too many to elaborate, played a far more dominant role in the history of political thought, the explosion of philosophy, which seeks to reorder political life at levels so far above the heroic as to transcend even the political. Now here I seem to be talking old-fashioned intellectual history, but I am doing so with the aim of arriving at the specifics of early modern political thought. And this, I want to suggest, is Latin rather than Attic in origin, and is shaped by historiography quite as much as by the much better known philosophy, though the role of the latter appears in the history of political thought far more prominently than does that of the former. But there appears in Rome itself, and is developed by intensive study in Europe during what we call Renaissance and Enlightenment, a historical narrative relating how Roman liberty released human energies called virtus or virtue that conquered an empire, how empire proved too great for virtue and corrupted it, and how the form of government we call the Principate, or vulgarly the Roman Empire, came to replace the rule we call that of the Roman Republic. This narrative is too complex and morally ambiguous to be reduced to philosophy or theory, though it can inform both. And I want to argue that this narrative is the chief legacy of Republican Rome to European political thought. At the moment when what we call the Roman Republic ends, the Romans, who continued to use the term res publica, called it libertas and the rule of the senatus populusque. Revelation occurs. I don't know how to exaggerate the significance of the circumstance or the coincidence that Jesus of Nazareth was born under Caesar Augustus and suffered under Pontius Pilate. That, as Christians say, the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us, at perhaps the best documented and most contentious moment in all Roman, which is to say, all civil history. To say nothing of the coincident moment it occupies in Jewish historiography, which now becomes part of the vocabulary of the slowly emerging political thought of Rome and Europe. The moment of Augustus, then, is also the moment of Christ. Two developments now occur. The Christian revelation, unlike, it would seem, its Abrahamic neighbours, offers a grace superseding law, from which churches and priests derive an authority unlike that of either republics or emperors. In the same era, however, Roman Empire gives birth to a universal civil law, in which the goods of social life are enjoyed under the protection of the sovereign, the prince, with the result that the libertas of the republic is partially replaced by the legalitas of the prince. A new kind of liberty, the freedom to hold property and engage in all manner of social pursuits under the protection of the law he proclaims and upholds. What will become the tension between republican and liberal concepts of liberty is born when prince, law, and church can be perceived as non-identical claimants to authority over law. As we all know, this takes a very long time, and the history of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire is needed to narrate it. A crucial moment in that much-debated process is the ransom and looting of the city of Rome by barbarian mercenaries in 410 CE. This provoked two major narratives written to argue that the disaster was not a consequence of the Christian abandonment of the gods of the city. Both narratives were the work of Latin speakers from the western provinces. One of these, the Spaniard Orosius, wrote what may be called a counter-history, designed to show that the conquering virtue of the pagan republic had caused disasters to both the Romans and those they conquered, far greater than those the Goths were currently causing at Rome. The African, Augustine, wrote what it is better to call an anti-history, declaring that the redemption of souls from their sin did not occur in, but rather outside, any process of history, whether the work of humans or of God guiding such a process, though no doubt he did. Both authors attacked the conquering virtue of the Republic. Augustine called libertas the libido dominandi, rather than the peaceable sociability of the law-governed empire, though both conceded that the latter might have been provided by God as a means to the spread of Christianity. Augustine merely insisted that the empire should not be seen as an apocalyptic preliminary to the return of Christ. A millennial language and its rejection are both integral to the formation of European political thought. There's much to be said for treating the history of political thought in the Latin Middle Ages in terms of the conflict and coexistence of papacy and empire, with their theological and philosophical implications capable of being related to Athenian political philosophy as rediscovered by Christendom and by Islam. The chief remaining theme being that of the encounter between Christianized barbaric kingship and the Roman feudal law systems that took shape in the Western empires and the Germanic Empire. And this indeed is how the history of political thought was shaped as an academic discipline when that began to happen about a century ago. And it helps account for the unsettled relationship between history and political theory or philosophy that still characterizes that discipline in our universities. In the last 50 years or so, however, a challenge has been posed to this view of the subject, which has changed it without overthrowing it. A recent and very good history of European political thought from 1450 to 1700, edited by a team of scholars at the University of Hull in England, has offered to survey the literature of political thought in the principal European cultures, while continuing to arrange the topic of political thought under the three headings of religion, philosophy, and law. The chapters, written by many authors, of which this volume consists, however, displaying the thought shaped in many European contexts, constantly reveal the presence of a fourth mode of thinking, to which the name humanism is fairly commonly given. In every case, furthermore, the political thought described by the last term emphasizes the notions of the individual as an active participant in the deeds and decisions of a political society, and that society is shown as existing in order, among other purposes, to provide the individual with the opportunity for such an activity. Historical consciousness and historical writing are not unknown in the political literature of the papacy and empire. But it's possible to begin a narrative from a point where this literature was seen, perhaps misleadingly, as relegated to a historical past. Leonardo Bruni composed the first volume of his History of the Florentine People in the early years of the 15th century, and presented an account of Roman and Latin European history, strikingly like those we find in the great enlightened historians 3 centuries after him. Bruni retold the story of how Republican liberty acquired an empire greater than it could bear, and he wondered whether a league of free Etruscan cities might not have been preferable to the cannibal virtue of Rome. The rule of the emperors, however, the rule of the Caesars, destroyed the elites of free citizens and left Mediterranean culture without the warlike virtue needed to resist barbarian invasion. Italy then found itself linked to a transalpine world of Goths, Franks, and Saxons, in which the bishops of Rome took control of the ecclesiastical network that had survived imperial authority. They were able to set up the Frankish kings as emperors in the West, but empire and papacy competed for universal authority until the temporary exhaustion of both in the 14th century left space for a few cities in Italy to claim autonomy as republics. Their autonomy, however, was insecure, and their liberty and culture and virtue were threatened by faction fighting, in both cases the consequence of the struggle from which they had emerged. And at this point, Bruni began to relate the history of Florence that had already begun to take shape. Now, here we have the germ of both humanist and enlightened historiography, with both the values and the insecurity of republican citizenship, something I have ventured to call the Machiavellian moment, at its center. Bruni is one of the central figures in the narrative of Hans Baron, who presented the Florentine rediscovery of liberty as the moment at which European political thought broke decisively with its papal and imperial civilian pasts. Now, this thesis needs a great deal of historical revision. which has been complicated, however, by the strong desire, the inherited instinct of many scholars to keep religion, philosophy, and law, as in the Hull volume I've mentioned, in the central role, relegating humanism and republicanism to the margins. And this is one source of the debate between republicanism and liberalism, using those words in quotation marks, that we are here to discuss. There are very strong arguments on both sides of this debate, and we're looking at a history of conflict and coexistence. Let us see how that might be told. What Bruni's narrative seems to omit is the true victor in the struggle between the popes and the Hohenstaufen in the 14th century, the Kingdom of France, in his time, of course, disintegrated by the Anglo-Burgundian Wars. His enlightened successor historians, Voltaire and Robertson and Gibbon, 3 centuries later, had to consider that kingdom's recovery from a further disintegration, that caused by the wars of religion in the 16th century. And this recovery, together with that of the Kingdom of England from its own civil wars, furnishes, rightly or wrongly, the dominant themes of our standard histories of early modern political thought, where the germs of a concept of liberalism are usually located. These conventional histories have focused, though never exclusively, on themes neither papal nor imperial, namely the rise of the state and of civil society in the kingdoms of France and England. They have dealt with the conflicts between monarchical sovereignty and civil systems of civil and customary law, the latter entailing an ideology of property at a time when land tenure and its history were being transformed by mercantile capital, and conflicts between sovereignty and ecclesiastical authority, ranging from papal to sectarian under the revolutionary impact of the Protestant Reformation. And here we re-encounter the theme of my title, Republics and Revelations. And the history of Florence reminds us that Machiavelli's account of the Republic, neo-pagan, if not yet secular in the enlightened sense, coincides in time with the account of the same given by Savonarola, in which, since all citizens are equal in authority, Christ must be king if there is to be any king at all. If republics could be situated in apocalyptic and messianic narratives of sacred history arising from revelation, the same is of course true of monarchies and empires. Histories of political thought centered on that of the West European kingdoms in the early modern period have focused on the rise of the sovereign state and its interactions with the liberties of estates, parliaments, and the individual. This is the growth point for everything we mean by the term liberalism, anachronistic though it is when used of this period, and it's vital to keep in mind that the companion term liberty is being used in more senses than one. In ancient, i.e. Greco-Roman usage, it meant the autonomy of the city and the individual's participation in exercising that sovereign autonomy. In post-feudal Europe, it came to mean the individual's freedom to enjoy what was called his property, a word of great philosophical complexity, by the way, under the protection of a law to which he enjoyed access. The term right, in due course, appears at this point. It is a term of law, and it is perceived on all sides that a system of law implies the presence of a sovereign who may or may not be identical with it. Political thought in the early modern period is therefore preoccupied with a dialectic between right and sovereignty. And this is the point at which the history of political thought becomes hardest to distinguish from the political theory that has emerged from it. The giant figures of the history of political theory, Jean Bodin in France, Thomas Hobbes and John Locke in England, make their appearance during this period. And each of them has as much to do with the relations between state and Christian religion as those between sovereignty, liberty, and law. Bodin's philosophical Judaism, Hobbes's ferocious anti-Hellenism, and Locke's cautious Socinianism connect all three with the impulse to diminish the Trinitarian account of Christ's nature, on which the Church's claim to an otherworldly authority chiefly rested. One can never overestimate the importance, which is not to say the success, of the campaign to reduce the independence of divine grace from civil authority in the early history of the modern state. And there is a powerful theological component in the history of liberalism itself. There is a double vision here. The relation of law to grace is one story, that of law to will is another. If we set alongside the history of political theory the history of historiography as a species of political thought, what is now to be noted is that English and French controversy in the early modern age entailed the historiography of historically specific political nations, each defined by a particular set of relationships between law and sovereignty, church and state, and by the ramifying controversies over these relationships that went on in the narrative of a particular collective experience. This species of historiography is now defined as nation-state history, a term often intended to dismiss it as obsolete and politically undesirable. But it's a major presence in the history of European historiography, and it's worth inquiring, of course, what political intentions today underlie the impulse to do away with it. If we now need other kinds of historiography, as we certainly do, it does not follow that we have ceased to need this one, for reasons that may include the political. Reverting to the political thought of the early modern period, we note that much of it went on within the contexts of this kind of history, and that to study it within these contexts, as has been a main theme in the scholarship of the last half-century, leads to the discovery of several kinds of political thought that enlarge our definition of that term. In England, they debate whether the central institutions of law and sovereignty are Anglo-Saxon or Norman in origin, the ancient constitution against the feudal law. In France, they go back further still and debate how far they are Roman or Frankish, the thèse royale against the thèse nobiliaire. It's worth inquiring how far other emergent national societies bring comparable debates to as high a level of organization as in the English and French cases. Underlying, but not controlling them, we find concepts drawn from philosophy. How is custom related to the law decreed by the sovereign will, and how are both to be seen as exercises of reason? And concepts arriving at philosophy by way of jurisprudence. How far is the individual's reason exercised through his property? And what happens if he has none, or it is in reality the property of another? Here the word property takes on a diversity of meanings, some of them entailing the construction of new historical narratives. In England particularly, where property had, or had above all, the meaning of tenure of land, fee simple, James Harrington traced a history of tenures back to the point where it made contact with the Mediterranean notion of the Republic as a community of armed freeholders, and with the Roman notion of the Republic's decay as the disappearance of such a class and its libertas. This was a point at which the political historiography of the Western kingdoms became connected with both antiquity and republicanism. Before pursuing its encounter with modernity and liberalism, however, there are some preliminaries to be noted. In giving priority, though not primacy, to Harrington in the English 17th century, I have of course reached a point where my reading of the relevant history differs from, without disagreeing with, that of Quentin Skinner. He has given priority to the philosophically much greater figure of Hobbes, and has reduced, at least I'd call it reducing, the republican notion of liberty to the neo-Roman, the term is his, contention that if your will, or the property through which you exercise it, is in the power of another, you are not your own master, but that other's servant or slave. Against this, Thomas Hobbes sets up the terrifying thesis that all you can do with your will is consent that it be exercised in your name by another, at which point he and you become not master and slave, but a single artificial person, or even artificial God. I am drastically simplifying an interpretation and a historical narrative with which I have no intention of disagreeing. But in offering to relate another narrative with Harrington at its centre, I shall be asking what and where were the historical consequences of Hobbes. They probably lie in the history of philosophy, while offering, as I have in the past, to relate the historical consequences of Harrington, which lie in the fields of historiography and political economy. In addition to Harrington and Hobbes, a third major figure now emerges, that of Hugo Grotius, author of The Laws of War and Peace, a classic in the literature that deals with the relations between the states we begin to call nations. From 1560 to 1660, Latin Europe had been devastated by wars between principalities and civil wars, both impelled by religious divisions and to be called wars of religion, and rendered uncontrollable by the ability of princes to raise large armies and set them fighting, but not to pay them long or regularly enough to prevent their devastating territories by living off the country and ceasing to be manageable instruments of state. Grotius, a Dutchman whose thinking was impelled as much by maritime and mercantile lawlessness at sea as by religious and mercenary warfare by land, helped develop the concept of an ecumeny in which the relations between states were those of either peace or war, and could be thought of as governed by systems of law originating in nature. The ability of a state to control its relations with other states was as important as its ability to exercise authority over its own subjects, and both became aspects of the concept of sovereignty. The ability of a state to control its relations with other states was as important as its ability to exercise authority over its own subjects. Though we think of international law as limiting the sovereignty of a state to act as it chooses, the work of Grotius went to heighten the notion of sovereignty to a point where sovereigns could escape religious and civil war into a world of sovereigns interacting with one another. It's no surprise, then, to find Grotius's theology interacting, as did those of Harrington and, more radically, Hobbes, towards a vision in which God reveals himself or enacts himself in the form of natural and civil law, and a grace which may transform or transcend law never negates or supersedes the natural. Grotius was certainly an Arminian and, very possibly, a Socinian, one who saw Christ as a being divine in mission, but not in substance, come more to preach a doctrine conducive to salvation than to effect it by the sheer power of what he was. This is a point at which Protestantism begins to mutate into Enlightenment, and the great debates of the 3rd and 6th Christian centuries were revived in early modernity. I propose to consider Enlightenment as a name, not a thing, a name for a number of processes that can be grouped together, but differ sufficiently and occur in a sufficient diversity of contexts to make it undesirable to speak of the Enlightenment as a unified process calling for unified explanation. It will also appear that I consider these phenomena during the 100 years preceding 1789 as occurring in early modern history and to be narrated as part of it. This for the reason that enlightened historiography, which I have made my subject, retains as dominant many of the characteristics of Renaissance humanist writing. Subject to these warnings, it's possible to say that developments of great importance began occurring in the later 17th century, and that it's useful to apply the concept or word of enlightenment as contemporaries were just beginning to do in speaking of them. I suggest then that there is to be found a general determination to have done with the religious civil wars conducted by mercenary armies that had afflicted peninsular and insular Europe since the mid-16th century, and to do this by means of a plurality of sovereign states, rather than by the hegemony of any one of them. At the levels of religion and philosophy, this entailed a determination to reduce the capacity of belief in divine grace to act contrary to the laws of civil society, though it is of the first importance to realize that what was entailed was less the commands of the sovereign, Leviathan, than the shared culture of a society increasingly seen as commercial, as beginning from the Anglo-Dutch moment of 1688. The overthrow of King James II was possible without plunging England into a civil war like that of 1642, because it was conducted by two professional armies, those of James and William of Orange, and the individual was thus spared the necessity of choosing a side, drawing his own sword, and facing the terrible problems of conscience and sovereignty that had made the English conflict one of the great moments in the history of political thought. The English were delivered from the world of Hobbes and Locke by an army maintained by Dutch merchant capital, that neither lived off the land, like those of the 30 Years' War, nor attempted revolution to avoid doing so, like the New Model Army in 1647. But the consequences were such that England found itself a new sort of state, obliged to maintain an army, to say nothing here of the navy that altered its role in world history, capable of acting in both European state politics and the competition for global empire. This was achieved by instituting a system of public investment that maintained a professional army as an arm and extension of the state. Why am I re-narrating this story as part of a history of political thought in an age of enlightenment? For the reason that it came to be realized that the power of the state rested on an investing public's confidence in the future stability of its regime and the prosperity of its commerce, and that this led to a rapidly increasing concern with civil society as the precondition of the state. With surprising speed, in England during the decade following the Revolution of 1688, and no doubt the same process is traceable in other national cultures, political society came to be defined in terms of commerce, and the individual citizen as transactor, even more than as proprietor. The philosophical consequences were many and various. Europe, for example, was redefined as a republic or commonwealth of sovereign states, maintained as a system of relationships by three major forces: the capacity to engage in war and peace, culminating in the power to make and sustain treaties; commerce in the usual sense of trade, which rendered them interdependent upon one another; and finally culture, known by the name of mœurs or manners, a system of social usages and social roles dependent upon commerce but also on cultural heritage very much older, which Europeans had in common and which polished and refined their dealings with one another. And this was the profile of the Ancien Régime, which Burke denounced the French Revolution as aiming to destroy. But it was modern in the sense that it was neither ancient nor medieval. And we need to re-inspect our use of this terminology, another reason I have for calling it early modern. As property became transactional, so too did philosophy and religion. The progress of society was redescribed as the establishment of stationary cultures, constituting a social space through which the exchange of goods, values, and ideas could go on. But philosophy, in the wake of Locke, began to inquire what could be known of a thing or idea or good beyond its changing meanings as it passed from one user to another. There were those who aimed to remove philosophy from the schools and situate it in the clubs and the drawing rooms, an important step, by the way, in the history of gender. But this was to convert it from knowledge to conversation, and the words commerce, conversation, and intercourse took on a diversity of meanings from the mercantile to the sexual. The conversion of knowledge into opinion was of vast importance to the program of ending religious war by establishing regimes of toleration, some of which, by the way, were less concerned with the rights of the individual against authority than with the rights of the sovereign against the church. His authority might be the more absolute when he was no longer obliged to persecute at religion's command. But the impact of toleration upon religion, that is to say, upon revealed religion, was profound. Christ became a being concerning whom one held opinions, but with whom one had no experiential encounter. And if one's opinion of him could never become a knowledge of his nature, it might follow that he had no nature that could be known. A dissolution of transcendent experience and of doctrine concerning it were necessary consequences of the creation of a tolerant society and its state. one of the earliest appearances of the term liberal in English to denote anything more than generosity is its use to denote a form of Christianity which placed tolerance above definable belief. 10 years after the English Revolution of 1688, when it was being debated whether to maintain the standing army founded on public credit that had been created to maintain the new regime, a Scottish historical philosopher, Andrew Fletcher, wrote to inquire what was being lost in attaining the immense goods of commercial society. He looked back, necessarily with nostalgia, to a Mediterranean or Gothic past in which the hoplite or freeman had appeared in arms which were his because he owned his own land, at the ecclesia or folkmoot in which he and his equals governed themselves. Fletcher did not deny that such a life had often been poor and brutal, but he feared the loss of republican virtue which must follow if standing army and public credit were necessary means of attaining commerce and enlightenment. To this, Daniel Defoe, a brilliant observer of contemporary historical change, something in itself historically new, replied that one might be not only richer and more enlightened, but actually more free if one were prepared to pay another to fight for one and elect another to govern as one's representative in a Hobbesian yet democratic sense. That remained unclear. How this might apply to one's relationship with God was a further question which neither Fletcher nor Defoe considered in 1698. What they were doing was putting forward two opposed conceptions of liberty: the freedom to be oneself in participating in self-government, and the freedom to pursue oneself in taking part in the innumerable social pursuits that opened up once commerce and the exchange of goods and values with others had revealed that there were other things to be done in society than the taking of political decisions, especially under the terrible conditions of religious civil war. The former ideal was, of course, ancient and was so named. The latter would very soon be called modern, and commerce would take its place beside Christianity as the forces which had displaced antiquity. One can read the 18th century as a series of debates between the ancient and modern ideas of liberty and even of the Republic. In Britain, where kingless government was not a possibility, as a series of brilliant debates, English in the first half of the century, Scottish in the second. In the United States, where debates over the Constitution and the founding ended in the triumph of the modern republic, but the survival of the idea of ancient virtue as a means of criticizing the corruption of the latter. In France, as the devastating reenactment of the history of a neo-Roman conquering republic, followed by a neo-Caesarean empire, after which liberalism is suddenly born as a philosophy, a practice, and a term of art, while Europe struggles to reconstitute the enlightened states' order of the Ancien Regime. We enter modern history, the world of the 19th and 20th centuries, and new problems in political and historical thought. This conference is sponsored by institutions German and Israeli, but I have spent most of my time talking about thinking rather more English than French. What has it enabled me to say about the problems we have come together to discuss? I present the early modern as a culture obsessed with the presence of antiquity, two antiquities indeed, one pagan and the other Christian, and able to envisage the ancient world as an era of heroic or saintly simplicities, in which the personality's engagement in politics was immediate and unmediated, and the commitment of the self to custom heroic and unspecialized. The commitment of the self, I should have said, to action heroic and unspecialized. The commercial revolution, as we may call the earlier phase of enlightenment, substituted a world in which the self was offered freedom to be many things, but might depute the management of self to many others. And one was left wondering where in all this freedom of choice the choosing self was still to be found. Was not the self simply the sum of its roles, the value of property simply the sum of its debits and credits, reality the sum of its images? And these are questions we're still asking ourselves. After the 2 centuries, from 1789 to 1989, in which revolution and empire, state and war seemed to exhaust the human capacity for self-assertion, we may now be facing a second enlightenment, directed this time not against the church, but against the self, its freedom to know itself and to associate in states whose autonomy consists in the freedom to debate histories of their own. If these are our problems, early modern Europe will certainly not supply us with the answers, but it may assist us in seeing how the questions came to be asked.